In the early years of World War II, German soldiers marched into battle convinced of one unshakable truth. They believed the United States was weak, divided, industrially inferior, and morally decayed. Nazi propaganda had spent years painting America as a collapsing society, a nation of racial chaos, economic misery, and undisciplined soldiers who would never withstand real war. Many German troops genuinely believed that if they were ever captured by the Americans, they would be starved, beaten, or executed. What actually happened shocked them far more than any battlefield defeat. For thousands of German soldiers captured in North Africa and later in Europe, the journey into American captivity became the moment their entire worldview began to collapse. After surrendering, many expected revenge. Instead, they were given water, then food, then medical care. Some were so suspicious that they refused to eat at first, convinced the meals were poisoned. Others waited for the abuse to begin. It never did. When German prisoners were transported across the Atlantic to the United States, fear followed them the entire way. Guards noticed that many prisoners stayed silent, tense, and rigid, men conditioned to expect cruelty. What they encountered upon arrival was something none of them had prepared for. The prison camps were clean, organized, quiet. But the real shock came at the dining halls. German POWs were served meals that, by wartime standards, were astonishing. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, coffee. In some camps, even desserts. These were not rare occasions. This was daily life. Guards ate the same food. There were no separate rations, no visible hierarchy of hunger. Many prisoners openly stared at their plates in disbelief. Some later admitted that this single moment did more damage to Nazi ideology than months of Allied bombing. As weeks passed, the psychological shock deepened. Prisoners were allowed to write letters home. They worked on nearby farms and factories, paid small wages according to the Geneva Convention. They interacted with American civilians, farmers, shop owners, families, people who were nothing like the caricatures they had been taught to hate. One German POW later recalled working on a farm in the Midwest. He expected hostility. Instead, the farmer's wife served him lunch at the same table as her children. No guards hovered nearby. No threats were spoken. The prisoner said that was the moment he realized the war, as he understood it, was a lie. Another prisoner described listening to American radio broadcasts in the camp. Jazz music, news reports that criticized American leaders openly, something unimaginable in Nazi Germany. At first, the prisoners assumed it was staged propaganda. Slowly, they realized it was normal. Freedom of thought existed here. Even discipline worked differently. American guards enforced rules firmly, but without humiliation. Punishments were predictable, regulated, and rarely violent. For men raised under a system built on fear and absolute obedience, this was deeply unsettling. Some prisoners became angry, others became quiet. A few fell into depression, not because of mistreatment, but because the enemy they were supposed to hate refused to behave like an enemy. The most profound moment came when news of the war reached the camps. As Germany began to collapse, prisoners gathered around radios, waiting for reports from Europe. When they learned that American troops had liberated concentration camps, many refused to believe it. It contradicted everything they had been told.
Some accused the Americans of lying. Then photographs appeared. Silence followed. Several former prisoners later admitted that captivity in the United States forced them to confront uncomfortable truths, not through punishment, but through contrast. The America they experienced was confident, productive, and shockingly humane in the middle of a global war. By the time the war ended, many German POWs dreaded returning home. Germany lay in ruins. America, by contrast, appeared untouched, organized, and hopeful. Some prisoners even requested to stay. Others eventually returned as immigrants years later. One former POW summarized the experience with a sentence that echoed through post-war interviews. "We lost the war long before we surrendered. We lost it the moment we realized our enemy did not need to become cruel to defeat us." For the United States, these camps became an unintended demonstration of power, not just military strength, but moral confidence. Without speeches or slogans, America dismantled an ideology by simply being itself. For the prisoners, captivity became something they never expected. Not a nightmare, but a revelation.
As the war dragged on, weeks inside American prisoner of war camps slowly turned into months, and something unexpected began to unfold. The rigid confidence many German soldiers had carried into captivity began to crack, not because of brutality, but because of quiet contradiction. These men had been trained to believe the United States was chaotic, morally weak, and incapable of sustained war. Yet every day they woke up inside a system that functioned calmly, efficiently, and without fear. In POW camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and California, the prisoners noticed details that no Allied propaganda could have explained away. African American and white guards worked side by side. Officers debated orders openly. Local newspapers openly criticized the American government, even during wartime. For men raised under a regime where disagreement was treated as treason, this was deeply unsettling. A society that allowed dissent was not supposed to survive, and yet it clearly had. At first, many prisoners dismissed what they saw as deception. Some believed they were being shown a carefully staged version of America. Others assumed the kindness was temporary, a trick that would disappear once the war turned. But as weeks passed, nothing changed. Meals remained consistent, medical care was real, punishment was rare and regulated. The system did not rely on fear. That realization alone disturbed many of the prisoners more than cruelty ever could. Inside the camps, older German officers tried to maintain discipline and ideology. They organized lectures, discouraged conversations with guards, and pressured younger soldiers to stay loyal to the Reich. But control was slipping. Reality was doing the work that force could not. No speeches were needed. The contrast spoke for itself. One former prisoner later recalled that his breaking point came not during interrogation, but while working on an American farm. He had been sent with a small group to help harvest crops under guard. At some point during the day, the guard set his rifle aside and walked away to speak with the farmer. For hours, no one watched him, no threats, no chains, just trust. That was the moment, he said years later, when I understood that the system I served was afraid of its own people. As time passed, many prisoners began learning English. Some joined makeshift orchestras. Others acted in improvised theater plays or attended classes offered by American volunteers. Libraries appeared inside camps. Sports leagues formed.
To soldiers who had been taught that every aspect of life must serve the war effort, the presence of culture during a total war felt almost unreal. But not everyone adapted.
For some prisoners, American treatment triggered anger rather than reflection. Every polite gesture felt like an accusation. Accepting kindness would mean admitting that the ideology they had fought for, killed for, was built on lies. These men isolated themselves, clinging to belief because the alternative was unbearable. Then came the news from Europe. When reports of the Normandy landings reached the camps, the atmosphere shifted overnight. It was not just the invasion itself, but the scale of it. Endless convoys, thousands of aircraft, tanks arriving faster than they could be destroyed. German prisoners realized that this was not simply courage, it was industrial dominance. The United States had transformed factories, logistics, and organization into weapons more powerful than ideology. For many, this was the moment they understood the war was lost. As 1944 turned into 1945, darker rumors began circulating. Stories of camps, executions, entire populations disappearing. At first, most prisoners rejected these claims outright. They believed them to be psychological warfare. But then, American officers began presenting evidence: photographs, captured documents, testimonies. There were no speeches, no insults, just facts. Silence followed. One former sergeant later wrote that captivity in the United States was the first time he felt truly defeated, not physically, but morally. He had survived combat, he had endured bombing, but standing in a camp, realizing what had been done in the name of the state he served, was something he was never prepared for. When the war finally ended, reactions inside the camps were mixed. Some men cheered, others cried, many simply sat in silence. The Germany that had sent them to war no longer existed. The world they had believed in had collapsed, and the nation that had defeated them was the one that had treated them with restraint and dignity. Many prisoners were eventually returned to a shattered Europe. Others, years later, legally immigrated back to the United States. Records exist of former POWs who returned to visit American families who had once guarded them, worked alongside them, or simply treated them as human beings. For those men, the lesson of captivity was permanent. The war was not won only on beaches or battlefields. It was won in factories, in farms, and in the quiet confidence of a system that did not need terror to function. The defeat they experienced did not come through violence, but through contrast. For many prisoners of war, the most powerful weapon the United States ever deployed was not a bomb or a rifle. It was reality.